Chapter 5. A Nightmare and a Cataclysm. And now swiftly followed that hideous experience which has left its indelible mark of fear on the soul of Marinus Bignell Willett, and has added a decade to the visible age of one whose youth was even then far behind. Dr. Willett had conferred at length with Mr. Ward, and had come to an agreement with him on several points, which both felt the alienists would ridicule. There was, they concluded, a terrible movement alive in the world, whose direct connection with a necromancy even older than the Salem witchcraft could not be doubted. That at least two living men, one other whom they dared not think, were in absolute possession of minds or personalities which had functioned as early as 1690, or before, was likewise as almost unassailably proved, even in the face of all known natural laws. What these horrible creatures, and Charles Ward as well, were doing or trying to do seemed fairly clear from their letters and from every bit of light, both old and new, which had filtered in upon the case. They were robbing the tombs of all the ages, including those of the world's wisest and greatest men, in the hope of recovering from the bygone ashes some vestige of the consciousness and law which had once animated and informed them. A hideous traffic going on among these nightmare ghouls, whereby illustrious bones were bartered with the calm calculativeness of schoolboys swapping books, and from what was extorted from this century dust there was anticipated a power and a wisdom beyond anything which the cosmos had ever seen concentrated in one man or group. They had found unholy ways to keep their brains alive, either in the same body or different bodies, and had evidently achieved a way of tapping the consciousness of the dead whom they gathered together. There had, it seemed, been some truth in chimerical old Borelius when he wrote of preparing from even the most antique remains certain essential salts, from which the shade of a long-dead living thing might be raised up. There was a formula for evoking such a shade, and another for putting it down, and it had now been so perfected that it could be taught successfully. One must be careful about evocations, for the markers of old graves are not always accurate. Willett and Mr. Ward shivered as they passed from conclusion to conclusion. Things, presences, or voices of some sort could be drawn down from unknown places, as well as from the grave, and in the process also one must be careful. Joseph Curwen had indubitably evoked many forbidden things, and as for Charles, what might one think of him? What forces outside the spheres had reached him from Joseph Curwen's day and turned his mind on forgotten things? He had been led to find certain directions, and he had used them. He had talked with the man of horror in Prague, and stayed long with the creature in the mountains of Transylvania. He must have found the grave of Joseph Curwen at last. That newspaper item and what his mother had heard in the night were too significant to overlook. Then he had summoned something, and it must have come. That mighty voice aloft on Good Friday, and those different tones in the locked attic laboratory. What were they like with their depth and hollowness? Was there not here some awful foreshadowing of the dreaded stranger Dr. Allen with his spectral bass? Yes, that was what Mr. Ward had felt with vague horror in his single talk with the man, if man it were, over the telephone. What hellish consciousness of voice, what morbid shade of presence had come to answer Charles Ward's secret rites behind that locked door? Those voices, heard in argument, must have it read for 3 months. Good God! Was not that just before the vampirism broke out? The rifling of Ezra Whedon's ancient grave, the cries later at Pawtuxet, whose mind had planned the vengeance and rediscovered the shunned seat of elder blasphemies. And then the bungalow, and the bearded stranger, and the gossip, and the fear. The final madness of Charles neither father nor doctor could attempt to explain, but they did feel sure that the mind of Joseph Curwen had come to earth again, and was following its ancient morbidities. Was demonic possession in truth a possibility? Allen had something to do with it, and the detectives must find out more about one whose existence menaced the young man's life. In the meantime, since the existence of some vast crypt beneath the bungalow seemed virtually beyond dispute, some effort must be made to find it. Willett and Mr. Ward, conscious of the skeptical attitude of the alienists, resolved during their final conference to undertake a joint secret exploration of unparalleled thoroughness, and agreed to meet at the bungalow on the following morning with valises and with certain tools and accessories suited architectural search and underground exploration. The morning of April 6th dawned clear, and both explorers were at the bungalow by 10 o'clock. Mr. Ward had the key, and an entry and a cursory survey were made. From the disordered condition of Dr. Allen's room, it was obvious that the detectives had been there before, and the later searchers hoped that they had found some clue which might prove of value. Of course, the main business lay in the cellar, so thither they descended without much delay, again making the circuit which each had vainly made before in the presence of the mad young owner. For a time everything seemed baffling, each inch of the earthen floor and stone walls having so solid and innocuous an aspect that the thought of a yearning aperture was scarcely to be entertained. Willett reflected that since the original cellar was dug without knowledge of any catacombs beneath, the beginning of the passage would represent the strictly modern delving of young Ward and his associates, where they had probed for the ancient vaults whose rumour could have reached them by no wholesome means. The doctor tried to put himself in Charles's place to see how a delver would likely start, but could not gain much inspiration from this method. Then he decided on elimination as a policy, and went carefully over the whole subterranean surface, both vertical and horizontal, trying to account for every inch separately. He was soon substantially narrowed down, and at last had nothing left but the small platform before the washtops, which he had tried once before in vain. Now experimenting in every possible way and exerting a double strength, he finally found that the top did indeed turn and slide horizontally on a corner pivot. Beneath it lay a trim concrete surface with an iron manhole, to which Mr. Ward had once rushed with excited zeal. The cover was not hard to lift, and the father quite removed it when Willett noticed the queerness of his aspect. He was swaying and nodding dizzily, and in the gust of noxious air which swept up from the black pit beneath, the doctor soon recognized ample cause. In a moment, Dr. Willett had his fainting companion on the floor above, and was reviving him with cold water. Mr. Ward responded feebly, but it could be seen that the mephitic blast from the crypt had in some way gravely sickened him. Wishing to take no chances, Willett hastened out to Broad Street for a taxicab, and had soon dispatched the sufferer home despite his weak-voiced protests, after which he produced an electric torch, covered his nostril with a band of sterile gauze, and descended once more to peer into the new-found depth. The foul air had now slightly abated, and Willett was able to send a beam of light down the Stygian hold. For about 10 feet, he saw, it was a sheer cylindrical drop with concrete walls and an iron ladder, after which the whole appeared to strike a flight of old stone steps which must originally have emerged to earth somewhat southwest of the present building. Part 2. Willett freely admits that for a moment the memory of the old curve and legend kept him from climbing down alone into that malodorous gulf. He could not help thinking of what Luke Fenner had reported on that last monstrous night. Then duty asserted itself, and he made the plunge, carrying a great valise for the removal of whatever papers might prove of supreme importance. Slowly, as befitted one of his years, he descended the ladder and reached the slimy steps below. This was ancient masonry, his torch told him, and upon the dripping walls he saw the old unwholesome moss of centuries. Down, down ran the steps, not spirally, but in 3 abrupt turns, and with such narrowness that 2 men could have passed only very difficultly. He had counted about 30 when a sound reached him very faintly, and after that he did not feel disposed to count any more. It was a godless sound, one of those low-keyed, insidious outrages of nature which are not meant to be. To call it a dull wail, a doom-dragged whine, or a hopeless howl of chorused anguish and stricken flesh without mind would be to miss its quintessential loathsomeness and soul-sickening overtones. Was it for this that Ward had seemed to listen on that day that he was removed? It was the most shocking thing that Willett had ever heard, and it continued from no determinate point as the doctor reached the bottom of the steps and cast his torchlight around to the lofty corridor walls, surmounted by cyclopean vaulting and pierced by numberless black archways. The hall in which he stood was perhaps 14 feet high in the middle of the vaulting and 10 or 12 feet abroad. Its pavement was of large, chipped flagstones, and its walls and roof were of dressed masonry. Its length he could not imagine, for it stretched ahead indefinitely into the blackness. Of the archways, some had doors of the old six-panelled colonial type, whilst others had none. Overcoming the dread induced by the smell and the howling, Willett began to explore these archways one by one, finding beyond them rooms with groined stone ceilings, each of a medium size and apparently bizarre uses. Most of them had fireplaces, the upper courses of whose chimney would have formed an interesting study in engineering. Never before or since had he seen such instruments or suggestions of instruments as here loomed up on every hand through the burying dust and cobwebs of a century and a half. In many cases evidently shattered by ancient raiders, for many of the chambers seemed wholly untrodden by modern feet, and must have represented the earliest and most obsolete phases of Joseph Curwen's experimentation. Finally, there came a room of obvious modernity, or at least recent occupancy. There were oil heaters, bookshelves and tables, chairs and cabinets, and a desk piled high with papers of varying antiquity, contemporaneousness. Candlesticks and oil lamps stood about in several places, and finding a match safe handy, Willett lighted such as were ready for use. In the fuller gleam, it appeared that this apartment was nothing less than the latest study or library of Charles Ward. Of the books, the doctor had seen many before, and a good part of the furniture had plainly come from the Prospect Street mansion. Here and there was a piece well known to Willett, and the sense of familiarity became so great that he half forgot the noisomeness and the wailing, both of which were plainer here than they had been at the foot of the steps. His first duty, as long planned ahead, was to find and seize any papers which might seem of vital importance, especially those portentous documents found by Charles so long ago behind the picture in Olney Court. As he searched, he perceived how stupendous a task the final unravelling would be. File for file was stuffed with papers in curious hands and bearing curious designs, so that months or even years might be needed for a thorough deciphering and editing. Once he found 3 large packets of letters with Prague and Rackus postmarks, writing clearly recognizable as Orne's and Hutchinson's, all of which he took with him as part of the bundle to be removed in his valise. At last, in a locked mahogany cabinet, once grazing the Ward home, Willett found the batch of old Curwen papers, recognizing them from the reluctant glimpse Charles had granted him those many years before. The youth had evidently kept them together very much as they had been when he first had found them, since all the titles recalled by the workmen were present except the papers addressed to Orne and Hutchinson, and a cipher with its key. Willett placed the entire lot in his valise and continued his examination of the files. Since young Ward's immediate condition was the greatest matter at stake, the closest searching was done among the most obviously recent matter, and in this abundance of contemporary manuscript, one very baffling oddity was noted. The oddity was the slight amount in Charles's normal writing, which indeed included nothing more recent than 2 months before. On the other hand, there were literally reams of symbols and formulae, historical notes and philosophical comment, in a crabbed penmanship absolutely identical with the ancient script of Joseph Curwen, though of undeniably modern dating. Plainly, a part of the letter-day program had been a sedulous imitation of the old wizard's writing, which Charles seemed to have carried to a marvellous state of perfection. Of any third hand, which might have been Allen's, there was not a trace. If he had indeed come to be the leader, he must have forced young Ward to act as his amanuensis. In this material, one mystic formulae, or rather pair of formulae, recurred so often that Willett had it by heart before he had half finished his quest. It consisted of 2 parallel columns, the left-hand one surmounted by the archaic symbol called Dragon's Head, and used in almanacs to indicate the ascending node, and the right-hand one headed by a corresponding sign of Dragon's Tail, or descending node. The appearance of the whole was something like this. Iagnaga, Yoxothoth, Heel Egip, Faith Ua Ok Throt Aif, Gebel Yoxothoth, Ngayai Thiro. Almost unconsciously, the Doctor realized that the second half was no more than the first written syllabically backward, with the exception of the final monosyllables and the odd name Yog-Sothoth, which he had come to recognize under various spellings from other things he had seen in connection with this horrible matter. The formulae were as follows, exactly so, as Willett is abundantly able to testify. The first one struck an odd note of uncomfortable latent memory in his brain, which he recognized later when reviewing the events of that horrible Good Friday of the previous year. So haunting were these formulae, and so frequently did he come upon them, that before the Doctor knew it, he was repeating them under his breath. Eventually, however, he felt he had secured all the papers he could to digest to the advantage for the present, hence resolved to examine no more, till he could bring the sceptical alienist en masse for an ampler and more systematic raid. He had still to find the hidden library, so leaving his valise in the lighted room, he emerged again into the black, noisome corridor, whose vaulting echoed ceaseless with that dull and hideous whine. The next few rooms he tried were all abandoned or filled only with crumbling boxes and ominous-looking leaden coffins, but impressed him deeply with the magnitude of Joseph Curwen's original operations. He thought of the slaves and seamen who had disappeared, of the graves which had been violated in every part of the world, and of what that final raiding party must have seen, and then he decided it was better not to think any more. Once a great stone staircase mounted at his right, and he deduced that this must have reached to one of the Curwen outbuildings, perhaps the famous stone edifice with its high slit-like windows, provided the steps he had descended had led from the steep-roofed farmhouse. Suddenly the walls seemed to fall away ahead, and the stench and the wailing grew stronger. Willett saw that he had come upon a vast open space, so great that his torchlight would not carry across it, and as he advanced he encountered occasional stout pillars supporting the arches of the roof. After a time he reached a circle of pillars grouped like the monolith of Stonehenge, with a large carved altar on a base of 3 steps in the centre, and so curious were the carvings on that altar that he approached to study them with his electric light. But when he saw what they were, he shrank away, shuddering, and did not stop to investigate the dark stains which discoloured the upper surface and had spread down the sides in occasional thin lines. Instead he found the distant wall and traced it as it swept around in a gigantic circle, perforated by occasional black doorways and indented by a myriad of shallow cells with iron gratings and wrist and ankle bonds on chains fastened to the stone of the concave rear masonry. These cells were empty, but still the horrible odour and the dismoaning continued, more insistent now than ever, and seemingly varied at times by a sort of slippery thumping. Part 3. From that frightful smell and that uncanny noise, Willett's attention could no longer be diverted. Both were plainer and more hideous in the great pillared hall than anywhere else, and carried a vague impression of being far below, even in this darkened netherworld of subterranean mystery. Before trying any of the black archways for steps leading further down, the Doctor cast his beam of light about the stone-flagged floor. It was loosely paved, and at irregular intervals there would occur a slab curiously pierced by small holes in no indefinite arrangement, while at one point there lay a very long ladder carelessly flung down. To this ladder, singularly enough, appeared to cling a particularly large amount of the frightful odour which encompassed everything. As he walked slowly about it, suddenly occurred to Willett that both the noise and odour seemed strongest above the oddly pierced slabs, as if they might be crude trapdoors leading down to some still deeper region of horror. Kneeling by one, he worked at it with his hands, and found that with extreme difficulty he could budge it. At his touch, the moaning beneath ascended to a louder key. Only with vast trepidation did he persevere in the lifting of the heavy stone. A stench unnameable now rose up from below, and the Doctor's head reeled dizzily as he laid back the slab and turned his torch upon the exposed square yard of gaping blackness. If he had expected a flight of steps to some wide gulf of ultimate abomination, Willett was destined to be disappointed. For amidst that fetor and cracked whining, he discerned only the brick-faced top of a cylindrical well, perhaps 1.5 yards in diameter and devoid of any ladder or other means of descent. As the light shone down, the wailing changed suddenly to a series of horrible yelps, in conjunction with which there came again the sound of blind, futile scrambling and slippery thumping. The explorer trembled, unwilling even to imagine what noxious thing might be lurking in that abyss, but in that moment mustered up enough courage to peer over the rough-hewn brink, lying at full length and holding the torch downward at arm's length to see what might lie below. For a second he could distinguish nothing but the slimy, moss-grown brick wall sinking illimitably into that half-tangible miasma of murk and foulness and anguished frenzy. And then he saw something dark was leaping clumsily and frantically up and down at the bottom of the narrow shaft, which must have been from 20 to 25 feet below the stone floor where he lay. The torch shook in his hand, but he looked again to see what manner of living creature might be immured there in the darkness of that unnatural well, left starving by young Ward through all the long month since the doctors had taken him away, and clearly only one of the vast number imprisoned in the kindred walls whose pierced stone covers so thickly studded the floor of the great vaulted cavern. Whatever the things were, they could not lie down in their cramped spaces, but must have crouched and whined and waded and feebly leaped at those hideous weeks since their master had abandoned them unheeded. But Mariner's Bignell Willett was sorry that he looked again, for surgeon and veteran of the dissecting room though he was, he has not been the same since. It is hard to explain just how a single sight of a tangible object with measurable dimension could so shake and change a man, and we may only say that there is about a certain outlines and entities of power of symbolisms and suggestion which act frightfully on the sensitive thinker's perceptive and whispers terrible hints of obscure cosmic relationships and unnameable realities behind the protective illusions of common vision. In that second look, Willett saw an outline, or entity, for during the next few instants he was undoubtedly as stark, raving mad as any inmate of Dr. Waite's private hospital. He dropped the electric torch from a hand drained of muscular power of nervous coordination, nor heeded the sound of the crunching teeth which told of its fate at the bottom of the pit. He screamed and screamed and screamed in a voice whose falsetto panic no acquaintance of his would have ever recognized, and though he could not rise to his feet, he crawled and rolled desperately away from the damp pavement where dozens of Tartarian wells poured forth their exhausting whining and yelping to answer to his own insane cries. He tore his hands on the rough, loose stones and many times bruised his head against the frequent pillars, but still he kept on. Then at last he slowly came to himself in the utter blackness and the stench, and stopped his ears against the droning wail into which the burst of yelping had subsided. He was drenched with perspiration and without means of producing a light, stricken and unnerved in the abysmal blackness and horror, and crushed with a memory he never could efface. Beneath him dozens of those things still lived, and from one of those shafts the cover was removed. He knew that what he had seen could never climb up those slippery walls, yet shuddered at the thought that some obscure foothold might exist in the pit. What the thing was, he would never tell. It was like some of the carvings on the hellish altar, but it was alive. Nature had never made it in this form, for it was too palpably unfinished. The deficiencies were of most surprising sort, and the abnormalities of proportion could not be well described. Willett consents only to say that this type of thing must have represented entities which Ward called up from imperfect salts, which he kept for servile or ritualistic purposes. If it had not had a certain significance, its image would not have been carved on that damnable stone. It was not the worst thing depicted on that stone, but Willett never opened the other pits. At the time, the first connected idea in his mind was an idle paragraph from some of the old Curvin data he had digested long before, a phrase used by Simon or Jedediah Orne in that portentous confiscated letter to the bygone sorcerer. Certainly there was nothing but your liveliest awfulness in that wish, raised up from what he could gather only a part of. Then, horribly supplementing rather than displacing this image, there came a recollection of those ancient lingering rumours anent the burned, twisted thing found in the fields a week after the Curvin raid. Charles Ward had once told the doctor what old Slocum said of that object, that it was neither thoroughly human nor wholly allied to any animal which Pawtuxet folk had ever seen or even read about. These words hummed in the doctor's mind as he rocked to and fro, squatting on the nitrous stone floor. He tried to drive them out and repeated the Lord's Prayer to himself, eventually trailing off into mnemonic hodgepodge like the modernistic The Waste Land of Mr. T.S. Eliot, and finally reverting to the oft-repeated dual formulae he had lately found in Ward's underground library, Ya Igne Nin Ya York Sothoth, and so on till the final underlined through. It seemed to soothe him, and he staggered to his feet after a time, lamenting bitterly his fright-lost torch and looking wildly about for any gleam of light in the clutching inkiness of the chilly air. Think he would not, but he strained his eyes in every direction for some faint glint or reflection of the bright illumination he had left in the library. After a while he thought he detected a suspicion of a glow infinitely far away, and toward this he crawled in agonized caution on hands and knees, amidst the stench and the howling, always feeling ahead, lest he collide with numerous great pillars or stumble into the abominable pit that he had uncovered. Once his shaking fingers touched something which he knew must be the steps leading to the hellish altar, and from this spot he recoiled in loathing. At another time he encountered the pierced slab he had removed, and here his caution became almost pitiful. But he did not come upon the dread aperture after all, nor did anything issue from that aperture to detain him. What had been down there made no sound, nor did it stir. Evidently its crunching of the falling electric torch had not been good for it. Each time Will's fingers felt the perforated slab, he trembled. His passage over it would sometimes increase the groaning below, but generally it would produce no effect at all, since he moved very noiselessly. Several times during the progress, the glow ahead diminished perceptibly, and he realized that the various candles and lamps he had left must be expiring one by one. The thought of being lost in utter darkness without matches, amidst this underground world of nightmare labyrinth, impelled him to rise to his feet and run, which he could safely do now that he had passed the open pit. For he knew that once the light failed, his only hope of rescue and survival would lie in whatever relief party Mr. Ward might send after missing him for a sufficient period. Presently, however, he emerged from the open space into the narrow corridor and definitely located the glow as coming from the door on his right. In a moment he had reached it and was standing once more in young Ward's secret library, trembling with relief and watching the sputterings of that last which had brought him to safety. Part 4. In another moment he was hastily filling the burned-out lamps from an oil supply he had previously noticed, and when the room was bright again he looked about to see if he might find a lantern for further exploration. For racked through though he was with horror, his sense of grim purpose was still uppermost, and he was firmly determined to leave no stone unturned in his search for the hideous facts behind Charles Ward's bizarre madness. Failing to find a lantern, he chose the smallest of the lamps to carry, also filling his pockets with candles and matches, taking with him a gallon can of oil, which he proposed to keep for reserve use in whatever laboratory he might uncover beyond the terrible open space with its unclean altar and nameless covered walls. To traverse that space again would require his utmost fortitude, but he knew it had to be done. Fortunately, neither the frightful altar nor the open shaft was near the vast cell-indented wall which bounded the cavern area, and whose black, mysterious archways would form the next goals of a logical search. So Willett went back to that great pillared hall of stench and anguished howling, turned down his lamp to avoid any distant glimpse of that hellish altar or of the uncovered pit with the pierced stone slab beside it. Most of the black doorways led merely to small chambers, some vacant and some evidently used as storerooms, and in several of the latter he saw some very curious accumulations of various objects. One was packed with rotting and dust-draped bales of spare clothing, and the explorer thrilled when he saw that it was unmistakably the clothing of a century and a half before. In another room he found numerous odds and ends of modern clothing, as if gradual provisions were being made to equip a large body of men. But what he disliked the most of all were the huge copper vats which occasionally appeared, these and the sinister incrustations upon them. He liked them even less than the weirdly figured leaden bowls, whose rims retained such obnoxious deposits, and around which clung repellent odours perceptible above even the general noisomeness of the crypt. When he had completed about half the entire circuit of the wall, he found another corridor like that from which he had come, and out of which many doors more opened. This he proceeded to investigate, and after entering 3 rooms of medium size of no significant content, he came at last to a large oblong apartment whose business-like tanks and tables and furnaces and modern instruments and occasional books and endless shelves of jars and bottles proclaimed it indeed the long-sought laboratory of Charles Ward, and, no doubt, of old Joseph Curwen before him. After lighting the 3 lamps which he found and filled ready, Dr. Willett examined the place and all appurtenances with the keenest interest, noting from the relative quantities of various reagents on the shelves that young Ward's dominant concern must have been with some branch of organic chemistry. On the whole, little could be learned from the scientific ensemble, which included a gruesome-looking dissecting table, so that the room was really rather a disappointment. Among the books was a tattered old copy of Borellus in black letters, and it was weirdly interesting to note that Ward had underlined the same passage whose marking had so perturbed good Mr. Merritt in Curwen's farmhouse more than a century and a half before. That old copy, of course, must have perished along with the rest of Curwen's occult library in the final raid. 3 archways opened off the laboratory, and these the doctor proceeded to sample in turn. From his cursory survey, he saw that 2 of them led merely to small storerooms, but these he canvassed with care, remarking the piles of coffins in various stages of damage, and shuddering violently at 2 or 3 of the few coffin plates that he could actually decipher. There was much clothing also stored in these rooms, and several new and tightly nailed boxes, which he did not stop to investigate further. Most interesting of all, perhaps, were some of the odd bits which he judged to be fragments of old Joseph Curwen's laboratory appliances. These had suffered damage at the hands of the raiders, but were still partly recognizable as the chemical paraphernalia of the Georgian period. The 3rd archway led to a very sizable chamber entirely lined with shelves, and having in the center a table bearing 2 lamps. These lamps Willett lighted, and in their brilliant glow studied the endless shelving which surrounded him. Some of the upper levels were wholly vacant, but the most space was filled with small, odd-looking leaden jars of 2 general types, one tall and without handles like a Grecian lekythos or oil jug, and the other with a single handle and proportioned like a Phaleron jug. All had metal stoppers, and all were covered with peculiar-looking symbols moulded in low relief. In a moment the doctor noticed that these jugs were classified with great rigidity, all the lekythoi being on one side of the room with a large wooden sign reading Custodes above them, all the Phalerons on the other correspondingly labelled with a sign reading Materia. Each of the jars of jugs, except some on the upper shelves that turned out to be vacant, bore a cardboard tag with a number apparently referring to a catalogue, and Willett resolved to look for the latter presently. For the moment, however, he was more interested in the nature of the array as a whole, and experimentally opened several of the lekythoi and Phalerons at random with a view to a rough generalization. The result was invariable. Both types of jar contained a small quantity of a single kind of substance, a fine dusty powder of very light weight, and many shades of dull neutral colour. To the colours, which formed the only point of variation, there was no apparent method of disposal, and no distinction between what occurred in the lekythoi and what occurred in the Phalerons. A bluish-grey powder might be by the side of a pinkish-white one, and any one in a Phaleron might have its exact counterpart in a lekythos. The most individual feature about the powders was their non-adhesiveness. Willett would pour out one into his hand, and upon returning it to its jug would find that no residue whatever remained on his palm. The meaning of the two signs puzzled him, and he wondered why this battery of chemicals was separated so radically from those in glass jars on the shelves of the laboratory proper. Custodies and materia, that was the Latin for guards and materials, respectively. And then there came a flash of memory as to where he had seen that word, guards, before in connection with this dreadful mystery. It was, of course, in the recent letter to Dr. Allen purporting to be from old Edwin Hutchinson, and the phrase had read, "There was no need to keep the guards in shape or eating off their heads, and it made much to be found in case of trouble, as you too well know." What did this signify? But wait, was there not still another reference to guards in this matter which he had failed wholly to recall when reading the Hutchinson letter? Back in the old non-secretive days, Ward had told him of the Eleazar Smith diary recording the spying of Smith and Whedon on the Curvent farm, and in that dreadful chronicle there had been a mention of conversations overheard before the old wizard betook himself wholly beneath the earth. There had been, Smith and Whedon insisted, terrible colloquies wherein figured Curwen, certain captives of his, and the guards of those captives. Those guards, according to Hutchinson or his avatar, had eaten their heads off, so that now Dr. Allen did not need to keep them in shape. And if not in shape, how save as the salts to which it appears this wizard band was engaged in reducing as many human bodies or skeletons as they could. So that was what these lekythoi contained, the monstrous fruit of unhallowed rites and deeds, presumably won or cowed to such submission as to help when called up by hellish incantation in the defense of their blasphemous master or the questioning of those who were not so willing again. Willett shuddered at the thought of what he had been pouring out into his hand, and for a moment felt an impulse to flee in panic from that cavern of hideous shelves with their silent and perhaps watching sentinels. Then he thought of the materia in the myriad feller on jugs on the other side of the room. Salts, too, and if not the salts of the guards, then salts of what? God, could it be possible that here lay the mortal relics of half the titan tinkers of all the ages, snatched by supreme ghouls from crypts where the world thought them to be safe, and subject to the beck and call of a madman who sought to drain their knowledge for some still wilder end, whose ultimate effect would concern, as poor Charles had hinted in his frantic note, all civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and the universe. And Mariner's Bignell Willett had sifted their dust through his very hands. Then he noticed a small door at the further end of the room, and calmed himself enough to approach it and examine the crude sign chiseled above. It was only a symbol, but it filled him with a vague spiritual dread, for a morbid dreaming friend of his had once drawn it on a paper and told him a few of the things it means in the dark abyss of sleep. This was the sign of Koth that dreamers see fixed above the archway of a certain black tower standing alone in twilight, and Willett did not like what his friend Randolph Carter had said of its powers. But a moment later he forgot the sign as he recognized a new acrid odor in the stench-filled air. This was a chemical rather than an animal smell, and came clearly from the room beyond the door. And it was unmistakably the same odor which had saturated Charles Ward's clothing on the day the doctors had taken him away. So it was here that the youth had been interrupted by the final summons. He was wiser than old Joseph Curwen, for he had not resisted. Willett, boldly determined to penetrate every wonder and nightmare of this nether realm might contain, seized the small lamp and crossed the threshold. A wave of nameless fright rolled out to meet him, but he yielded to no whim and deferred to no intuition. There was nothing alive here to harm him, and he would not be stayed in his piercing of the eldritch cloud which now engulfed his patient. The room beyond the door was of medium size and had no furniture save a table, a single chair, and two groups of curious machines with clamps and wheels, which Willett recognized after a moment as medieval instruments of torture. On one side of the door stood a rack of savage whips, above which were some shelves bearing empty rows of shallow pedestaled cups of lead shaped like Grecian Qa'Rajhs. On the other side of the table, with a powerful argand lamp and a pad and a pencil, and two of the stoppered lithoi from the shelves outside set down at irregular places, as if temporarily or in haste. Willett lighted the lamp and looked carefully at the pad to see what notes Ward might have been jotting down when he was interrupted. But he found nothing more intelligible than the following disjointed fragments in that crabbed Curvin's chirography, which shed no light on the case as a whole. B. Dared not, escaped into walls and found place below, saw old V, say ye Sabbath, and learned ye way, raised Yog-Sothoth thrice, and was next day delivered. F sought to wipe out all, knowing how to raise those from outside. As the strong argand blaze lit up the entire chamber, the doctor saw that the wall opposite the door, between the two groups of torturing appliances in the corners, was covered with pegs from which hung a set of shapeless-looking robes on a rather dismal yellowish white. But far more interesting were the two vacant walls, both of which were thickly covered with mystic symbols and formulae roughly chiseled in the smooth-dressed stone. The damp floor also bore marks of carving, and with little but difficulty Willett deciphered a huge pentagram in the center, with a plain circle about 3 feet wide halfway between this and each corner. In one of the 4 circles, near where a yellowish robe had been flung carelessly down, there stood a shallow calyx of the sort found on the shelves above the whip rack, and just outside the periphery was one of the Phaleron jugs from the shelves in the other room, its tag numbered 118. This was unstoppered and proved upon inspection to be empty, but the explorer saw with a shiver that the calyx was not. Within its shallow area, and saved from scattering only by the absence of wind in this sequestered cavern, lay a small amount of dry, dull greenish, efflorescent powder which must have belonged in the jug. And Willett almost reeled at the implications that came sweeping over him as he correlated little by little the several antecedents of the place. The whips and instruments of torture, the dusts or salts from the jug of materia, the 2 lithoi from the custodies shelf, the robes, the formulae on the walls, the notes on the pad, the hints from letters and legends, and the 1,000 glimpses of doubts, suppositions, which had come to torment the friends and parents of Charles Ward. All these engulfed the doctor in a tidal wave of horror as he looked at that dry greenish powder outspread on the pedestal leaden Qa'Rajhs on the floor. With an effort, however, Willett pulled himself together and began studying the formulae chiseled on the walls. From the stained and encrusted letters, it was obvious that they were carved in Joseph Curwen's time, and the text was such to be vaguely familiar to one who had read much Curwen material or delved extensively into the history of magic. One the doctor clearly recognized as what Mrs. Ward heard her son chanting on that ominous Good Friday just a year before. And what an authority had told him was a very terrible invocation addressed to secret gods outside the normal spheres. It was not spelled here exactly as Mrs. Ward had set it down from memory, nor yet as the authority had shewn it to him in the forbidden pages of Eliphas Levi. Its identity was unmistakable, and such words as Sabaoth, Metraton, Almonsin, and Serianatmeg sent a shudder of fright through the searcher who had seen and felt much of cosmic abomination just around the corner. This was on the left-hand wall as one entered the room. The right-hand wall was no less thickly inscribed, and Willett felt a start of recognition when he came upon a pair of formulae so frequently occurring in the recent notes in the library. They were, roughly speaking, the same with the ancient symbols of Dragon's Head and Dragon's Tail, heading them in Ward's scribblings. But the spelling differed quite widely from that of the modern versions, as if old Curwen had had a different way of recording sound, or as if later study had evolved more powerful and perfected variants of the invocations in question. The doctor tried to reconcile the chiseled version with the one which still ran persistently in his head, and found it quite hard to do. With the script he had memorized began, Ya ai nga nga yok sothoth. This epigraph started out as Ai siangach yoke sothotha, which to his mind would seriously interfere with the syllabification of the second word. Ground as the later text was into his consciousness, the discrepancy disturbed him, and he found himself chanting the first of the formulae aloud in an effort to square the sound he conceived with the letters that he found carved. Weird and menacing in that abyss of antique blasphemy rang his voice, in accents keyed to a droning sing-song, either through the spell of the past and the unknown, or through the hellish example of that dull, godless wail from the pits whose inhuman cadences rose and fell rhythmically in the distance through the stench and the darkness. Ja, na, York sothos, here gib, faal throdok, ooah. But what was this cold wind which had sprung into life at the very outset of the chant? The lamps were sputtering woefully, and the gloom grew so dense that the letters on the wall nearly faded from sight. There was smoke too, and an acrid odour which quite drowned out the stench from the faraway wells, an odour like that he had smelt before, yet infinitely stronger and much more pungent. He turned from the inscriptions to face the room with its bizarre contents, and saw that the calyx on the floor in which the ominous fluorescent powder had lain was giving forth a cloud of thick greenish black vapour of surprising volume and opacity. That powder! Great God, it had come from the shelf of materia. What was it doing now, and what had started it? The formula he had been chanting, the first of the pair, Dragon's Head ascending note. Blessed Saviour, could it be? The doctor reeled, and through his head raised wildly disjointed scraps from all that he had seen or heard and read of the frightful case of Joseph Curwen and of Charles Dexter Ward. I say to you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down. Have your words for laying at all times ready, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom you have. 3 talks with what was therein inhumed. Mercy of heaven! What is this shape behind the parting smoke? Part 5. Mariner's Bignell Willett has no hope that any part of his tale will be believed except by certain sympathetic friends, hence he had made no attempt to tell it beyond his innermost intimate circle. Only a few outsiders have ever heard it repeated, and of these the majority laugh and remark that the doctor surely is getting old. He has been advised to take a long vacation and to shun future cases dealing with mental disturbances, but Mr. Ward knows that the veteran physician speaks only a horrible truth. Did he not himself see the noisome aperture in the bungalow cellar? Did not Willett send him home overcome and ill at 11 o'clock that portentous morning? Did he not telephone the doctor in vain that evening and again the next day, and had he not driven to the bungalow itself on that following noon, finding his friend unconscious but unharmed on one of the beds upstairs? Willett had been breathing stertoriously, and opened his eyes slowly when Mr. Ward gave him some brandy fetched from the car. Then he shuddered and screamed and crying out, "That beard, those eyes! God, who are you?" A very strange thing to say to a trim, blue-eyed, clean-shaven gentleman whom he had known from the latter's boyhood. In the bright noon sunlight, the bungalow was unchanged since the previous morning. Willett's clothing bore no disarrangement beyond certain smudges, and worn in places at the knees, and only a faint, acrid odour reminded Mr. Ward of what he had smelt on his son that day that he was taken to the hospital. The doctor's flashlight was missing, but his valise was safely there, as empty as when he has brought it. Before indulging in any explanations, and obviously with great moral effort, Willett staggered dizzily down to the cellar and tried the fateful platform before the tubs. It was unyielding. Crossing to where he had left his yet unused tool satchel the day before, he obtained a chisel and began to pry the stubborn planks one by one. Underneath, the smooth concrete was still visible, but any opening and perforation there was no longer a trace. Nothing yawned this time to sicken the mystified father who had followed the doctor downstairs. Only the smooth concrete underneath the planks. No noisome well, no world of subterranean horrors, no secret library, no curving papers, no nightmare pits of stench and howling, no laboratory or shelves of chiseled formula, no... Dr. Willett turned pale and clutched at the younger man. Yesterday, he asked softly. Did you see it here? And smell it? And when Mr. Ward himself, transfixed with dread and wonder, found strength to nod an affirmative, the physician gave a sound, half a sigh and half a gasp, and nodded in turn. Then I will tell you, he said. So for an hour, in the sunniest room they could find upstairs, the physician whispered his frightful tale to the wondering father. There was nothing to relate beyond the looming up of that form when the greenish-black vapour from the calyx parted, and Willett was too tired to ask himself what had actually occurred. There were futile, bewildered head-shakings from both men, and once Mr. Ward ventured a hushed suggestion. Do you suppose it would be any use to dig? The doctor was silent, for it seemed hardly fitting for any human brain to answer when powers of unknown spheres had so vitally encroached on this side of the great abyss. Again Mr. Ward asked, But where did it go? It brought you here, you know, and it sealed up the hole somehow. And Willett again let silence answer for him. But after all, this was not the final phase of the matter. Reaching for his handkerchief before rising to leave, Dr. Willett's fingers closed upon a piece of paper in his pocket, which had not been there before, and which was accompanied by the candles and matches he had seized in the vanished vault. It was a common sheet, torn obviously from the cheap pad in that fabulous room of horror somewhere underground, and the writing upon it was of an ordinary lead pencil, doubtless the one which had lain beside the pad. It was folded very carelessly, and beyond the faint acrid scent of the cryptic chamber bore no print or mark of any world but this. In the text itself it did indeed reek with wonder, for there was no script of any wholesome age, but the laboured strokes of medieval darkness, scarcely legible to the layman who now strained over it, yet having combinations of symbols which seemed vaguely familiar. The briefly scrawled message lent purpose to the shaken pair, who forthwith walked steadily out to the ward car and gave orders to be driven first to a quiet dining place and then to John Hay Library on the hill. At the library it was easy to find good manuals of paleography, and over these the two men puzzled till the lights of the evening shone out from the great chandelier. In the end they found what was needed. The letters were indeed no fantastic invention, but the normal script of a very dark period. They were the pointed Saxon minuscules of the 8th or 9th century A.D., and brought with the memories of an uncouth time when under a fresh Christian veneer ancient faith and ancient rites stirred stealthily, and the pale moon of Britain looked sometimes on strange deeds in the Roman ruins of Caerleon and Hexius, and by the towers along Hadrian's crumbling wall. The words were such in Latin as a barbarous age might remember. Corvinus necandus est cadaver aquae forte, dissolvendum nec aliquid retinendum tasse ut potes, which may roughly be translated, Curven must be killed, the body must be dissolved in aqua fortis, nor must anything be retained. Keep silence as best you are able. Willett and Mr. Ward were mute and baffled. They had met the unknown and found that they lacked emotions to even respond to it as they vaguely believed they ought. With Willett, especially, the capacity for receiving fresh impressions of awe was well nigh exhausted, and both men sat still, helpless, till the closing of the library, which forced them to leave. Then they drove listlessly to the Ward mansion in Prospect Street and talked to no purpose into the night. The doctor rested toward morning but did not go home, and he was still there Sunday noon when a telephone message came from the detectives who had been assigned to look up Dr. Allen. Mr. Ward, who was pacing nervously about in a dressing gown, answered the call in person and told the men to come up early the next day when he heard the report was almost ready. Both Willett and he were glad that this phase of the matter was taking form, for whatever origin of the strange minuscule message, it seemed certain the Curven, who must be destroyed, could be no other than the bearded, spectacled stranger. Giles had feared this man, and had said in the frantic note that he must be killed and dissolved in acid. Allen, moreover, had been receiving letters from the strange wizards in Europe under the name of Curwen, and palpably regarded himself as an avatar of the bygone necromancer. And now, from a fresh and unknown source, had come a message saying that Curwen must be killed and dissolved in acid. The linkage was too unmistakable to be factitious, and besides, was not Allen planning to murder young Ward upon the advice of the creature called Hutchinson? Of course, the letter they had seen had never reached the bearded stranger, but from its text They could see that Alan had already formed plans for dealing with the youth if he grew too squeamish. Without a doubt, Alan must be apprehended, and even if the most drastic directions were not carried out, he must be placed where he could inflict no harm upon Charles Ward. That afternoon, hoping against hope to extract some gleam of information and into the inmost mysteries from the only available one capable of giving it, the father and doctor went down to the bay and called on young Charles at the hospital. Simply and gravely, Willett told him all that he had found, noticed how pale he turned as each description made certain the truth of the discovery. The physician employed as much dramatic effect as he could and watched for a wincing on Charles's part when he approached the matter of the covered pits and the nameless hybrids within. But Ward did not wince. Willett paused, and his voice grew indignant as he spoke of how things were starving. He taxed the youth with shocking inhumanity and shivered when only a sardonic laugh came in reply. For Charles, having dropped as useless his pretense that the crypt did not exist, seemed to see some ghastly jest in this affair, chucked hoarsely at something which apparently seemed to amuse him. Then he whispered in accents doubly terrible because of the cracked voice he used, "Damn them, they do eat, but they don't need to. That's the rare part. A month, you say, without food? Lud, sir, you'd be modest. You know that was a joke on poor old Whipple with his virtuous bluster. Kill everything off, would he? Why, damn, he was half deaf with noise from outside and never saw or heard aught from the wells. He never dreamed they were there at all. Devil take ye! Those cursed things have been howling down there ever since Curwen was done for 157 years gone." But no more than this could Willett get from the youth. Horrified, yet almost convinced against his will, he went on with his tale in the hope that some incident might startle the auditor out of this mad composure that he suddenly seemed to maintain. Looking at the youth's face, the doctor could not but feel a kind of terror at the changes which recent months had wrought. Truly the boy had drawn down nameless horrors from the skies. When the room with formulae and greenish dust was mentioned, Charles shewed the first sign of animation. A quizzical look overspread his face as he heard what Willett had read on a pad and had ventured the mild statement that those notes were old ones of no possible significance to anyone but deeply initiated in the history of magic. But, he added, had you but known the words to bring up that which I had out in the cup, you had not been here to tell me this. 'Twas number 118, and I conceive you would have shook had you looked it up in my list in the other room. 'Twas never raised by me, but I meant to have it up by that day you came to invite me hither. Then Willett told of the formula he had spoken, and of the greenish-black smoke which had arisen. As he did so, he saw true fear drawn for the first time on Charles Ward's face. "It came, and you be here alive?" As Ward croaked the words, his voice seemed almost to burst free of its trammels and sink to cavernous abysses of uncanny resonance. Willett, gifted with a flash of inspiration, believed that he saw the situation and wove into his reply a caution from a letter he remembered. "Number 111, you say, but don't forget that stones are all changed now in the 9 grounds out of 10. You are never sure till you question." And then, without warning, he drew forth the minuscule message and flashed it before the patient's eyes. He could have wished no stronger result, for Charles Ward fainted forthwith. All this conversation, of course, had been conducted with the greatest secrecy, lest the resident alienist accuse the father and the physician of encouraging a madman further into his delusions. Unaided, too, Dr. Willett and Mr. Ward picked up the stricken youth and placed him on the couch. In reviving, the patient mumbled many times of some word which he must get to Orne and Hutchinson at once, so when his consciousness seemed fully back, the doctor told him that of strange creatures at least one was his bitter enemy, and had given Dr. Allen advice for his assassination. This revelation produced no visible effect, and before it was made the visitors could see that their host had already the look of a haunted man. After that he would converse no more, so Willett and the father departed presently, leaving behind a caution against the bearded Allen, to which the youth only replied that this individual was very safely taken care of, and could do no one any harm, even if he wished to do so. This was said with an almost evil chuckle, very painful to hear. They did not worry about any communications Charles might write to that monstrous pair in Europe, since they knew that the hospital authorities ceased all outgoing mail for censorship and would pass no wild or ultra-looking missive. There is, however, a curious sequel to the matter of Orne and Hutchinson, if such indeed the exiled wizards were. Moved by some vague presentiment amidst horrors of that period, Willett arranged with an international press-cutting bureau for accounts of notable crimes and accidents in Prague and in eastern Transylvania, and after 6 months believed that he found 2 very significant things among the multifarious items he received and had translated. One was of the total wrecking of a house by night in the oldest quarter of Prague, and the disappearance of the evil old man called Joseph Nade, who had dwelt in it alone ever since anyone could remember. The other was a titan explosion in the Transylvanian mountains east of Rakus, and the utter extirpation with all its inmates of the ill-regarded Castle Ferenci, whose master was so badly spoken of by peasants and soldiery alike that he would shortly have been summoned to Bucharest for serious questioning had not this incident cut off a career already so long to antedate all common memory. Willett maintains that the hand which wrote these minuscules was able to wield stronger weapons as well, and that while Curwen was left to him to dispose of, the writer felt able to find and deal with Orne and Hutchinson itself. Of what their fate may have been, the Doctor strives sedulously not to think. Part 6. The following morning, Dr. Willett hastened to the ward home to be present when the detectives arrived. Alan's destruction, or imprisonment, or Curwen's, if one might regard the tacit claim to reincarnation as valid, he felt must be accomplished at any cost, and he communicated this conviction to Mr. Ward as they sat waiting for the men to come. They were downstairs this time, for the upper parts of the house were beginning to be shunned because of a particular nauseousness which hung indefinitely about, a nauseousness which the older servant connected with some curse left by the vanished Curwen portrait. At 9 o'clock the 3 detectives presented themselves and immediately delivered all that they had to say. They had not, regrettably enough, located the braver Tony Gomez as they had wished, nor had they found the last trace of Dr. Allen's source or present whereabouts, but they had managed to unearth a considerable number of local impressions and facts concerning the reticent stranger. Allen had struck Pawtuxet people as a vaguely unnatural being, and there was a universal belief that his thick sandy beard was either dyed or false, a belief conclusively upheld by the finding of such a false beard, together with a pair of dark glasses in his room at the fateful bungalow. His voice, Mr. Ward could well testify from his one telephone conversation, had a depth and a hollowness that could not be forgotten, and his glance seemed malign even through his smoked and horn-rimmed glasses. One shopkeeper in the course of negotiation had seen a specimen of his handwriting and declared it was very queer and crabbed, this being confirmed by pencil notes of no clear meaning found in his room and identified by the merchant. In connection with the vampirism rumors of the preceding summer, a majority of the gossips believed that Allen, rather than Ward, was the actual vampire. Statements were also obtained from the officials who had visited the bungalows after the unpleasant incident of the motor truck robbery. They had felt less of the sinister in Dr. Allen, but had recognized him as the dominant figure in the queer, shadowy cottage. The place had been too dark for them to observe him clearly, but they would know him again if they ever saw him. His beard had looked odd, and they thought he had some slight scar above his dark-spectacled right eye. As for the detective's search of Allen's room, it yielded nothing definite save for the beard and the glasses, and several pencil notes in a crabbed writing, which Willett at once saw was identical with that shared by the old Curwen manuscripts and by the voluminous recent notes of young Ward found in the vanished Catacombs of Horror. Dr. Willett and Mr. Ward caught something of a profound, subtle, and insidious cosmic fear from this data as it was gradually unfolded, which had almost trembled in the following up the vague, mad thought which had simultaneously reached their minds. The false beard and glasses, the crabbed Curwen penmanship, the old portrait and its tiny scar, and the altered youth in the hospital with such a similar scar, that deep, hollow voice on the telephone. Was it not this or that Mr. Ward was reminded when his son barked forth those pitiable tones to which he now claimed to be reduced? Who had ever seen Charles and Allen together? Yes, the officials had once, but who later on? Was it not when Allen left that Charles suddenly lost his growing fright and began to live wholly in the bungalow? Curwen, Allen, Ward, in what blasphemous, abominable fusion had 2 ages and 2 persons become involved? That damnable resemblance to the picture, to Charles. Had it not used to stare and follow the boy around the room with its eyes? Why, too, did both Allen and Charles copy Joseph Curwen's handwriting, even when alone and off guard. And then the frightful work of those people, the lost crypt of horrors that had aged the Doctor overnight, the starving monsters in the noisome pits, the awful formula which had yielded such nameless results, the message in minuscules found in Willet's pocket, the papers and the letters, and all the talk of graves and sorts and discoveries. Whither did everything lead? In the end, Mr. Ward did the most sensible thing. Steeling himself against any realization of why he did it, he gave the detectives an article to be shown to such Partoxet shopkeepers as had seen the portentous Dr. Allen. The article was a photograph of his luckless son, on which he now carefully drew in ink the pair of heavy glasses and the black pointed beard which the men had brought from Allen's room. For 2 hours he waited with the Doctor in the oppressive house where fear and miasma were slowly gathering as the empty panel in the upstairs library leered and leered and leered. Then the men returned. Yes, the altered photograph was a very passable likeness of Dr. Allen indeed. Mr. Ward turned pale, and Willett wiped a suddenly dampened brow with his handkerchief. Allen, Ward, Curwen. It was becoming too hideous for coherent thought. What had the boy called out of the void, and what had it done to him? What really happened from first to last? Who was this Allen who sought to kill Charles as too squeamish? And why had his destined victim said in the postscript that the frantic letter that he must be so completely obliterated in acid? Why, too, had the minuscule message, of whose origin no one dared to think, said that Curwen must likewise be obliterated? What was the change, and when had the final stage occurred? That day, when his frantic note was received, he had been nervous all the morning, and then there was an alteration. He had slipped out unseen and swaggered boldly in the past the men hired to guard him. That was the time when he was out. But no, had he not cried out in terror as he entered his study, this very room? What had he found there? Oh, wait, what had found him? That simulacrum which brushed boldly in without having been seen to go, was that an alien shadow and a horror forcing itself upon a trembling figure which had never gone out at all? Had not the butler spoken of queer noises? Will rang for the man and asked him some low-toned questions. It had, surely enough, been a bad business. There had been noises, a cry, a gasp, a choking, and a sort of clattering or creaking or thumping, or all of these together. And Mr. Charles was not the same when he stalked out without a word. The butler shivered as he spoke and sniffed the very heavy air that blew down from some open window upstairs. Terror had settled definitely upon the house, and only the business-like detectives failed to imbibe a full measure of it. Even they were restless, for this case had held vague elements in the background which pleased them not at all. Dr. Willett was thinking deeply and rapidly, and as his thoughts were terrible ones. Now and then he would almost break into muttering as he ran over in his head a new and appalling and increasingly a conclusive chain of nightmare happenings. Then Mr. Ward made a sign that the conference was over, and everyone save him and the doctor left the room. It was noon now, but the shadows as of coming night seemed to engulf the phantom-haunted mansion. Willett began talking very seriously to his host, and urged that he leave a great deal of the future investigation to him. There would be, he predicted, certain obnoxious elements which a friend could bear better than a relative. As a family physician he must have a free hand, and the first thing he required was a period alone and undisturbed in the abandoned library upstairs, where the ancient overmantel had gathered about itself in an aura of noisome horror more intense than when Joseph Curwen's features themselves glanced slyly down from the painted panel. Mr. Ward, dazed by the flood of grotesque morbidities and unthinkably maddening suggestions that poured in upon him from every side, could only acquiesce. And half an hour later, the doctor was locked in the shunned room with the panelling from Olney Court. The father, listening outside, heard fumbling sounds of moving and rummaging as the moments passed, and finally a wrench and a creak as if a tight cupboard door were being opened. Then there was a muffled cry, a kind of snorting choke, and a hasty slamming of whatever had been opened. Almost at once the key rattled and Willett appeared in the hall, haggard and ghastly, demanding wood for the real fireplace on the south wall of the room. The furnace was not enough, he said, and the electric log had little practical use. Longing, yet not daring to ask questions, Mr. Ward gave the requisite order, and a man brought some stout pine logs, shuddering as he entered the tainted air of the library, to place them in the grate. Willett, meanwhile, had gone up to the dismantled laboratory and brought down a few odds and ends not included in the moving of the July before. They were in the covered basket, and Mr. Ward never saw what they were. Then the doctor locked himself in the library once more, and by the clouds of smoke which rolled down past the windows from the chimney, it was known that he had lighted the fire. Later, after a great rustling of newspapers, that odd wrench and creaking were heard again, followed by a thumping which none of the eavesdroppers liked. Thereafter, 2 suppressed cries of Willett's were heard, and hard upon these came a swishing rustle of indefinable hatefulness. Finally, the smoke that the wind beat down from the chimney grew very dark and acrid, and everyone wished that the weather had spared them this choking and venomous inundation of peculiar fumes. Mr. Ward's head reeled, and the servants all clustered together in a knot to watch the horrible black smoke swoop down. After an age of waiting, the vapours seemed to lighten, and half-formless sounds of scraping, sweeping, and other minor operations were heard behind the bolted door. And at last, after the slamming of some cupboard within, Willett made his appearance, sad, pale, and haggard, and bearing the cloth-draped basket he had taken from the upstairs laboratory. He left the window open, and into that once accursed room was pouring a wealth of pure, wholesome air to mix with the queer smell of disinfectants. The ancient overmantel still lingered, but it seemed robbed of any malignity now, and rose as calm as stately in its white panelling as if it had never borne the picture of Joseph Curwen. Night was coming on, yet this time its shadows held no latent frights, but only a gentle melancholy. Of what he had done the doctor would never speak. To Mr. Ward he said, "I can answer no questions, but I will say that there are different kinds of magic. I have made a great purgation, and those in this house will sleep better for it." Part 7. That Dr. Willett's purgation had been an ordeal, almost nerve-wracking in its way, as his hideous wandering in the vanished crypts shown by the fact that the elderly physician gave out completely as soon as he reached home that evening. For 3 days he rested constantly in his rooms, though servants later muttered something about having heard him after midnight on Wednesday, when the outer door softly opened and closed with phenomenal softness. Servants' imaginations fortunately are limited, else comment might have been excited by an item in Thursday's evening bulletin, which ran as follows. North End ghouls again active. After a lull of 10 months since the dastardly vandalism in the Ween lot at the North Burial Ground, a nocturnal prowler was glimpsed early this morning in the same cemetery as by Robert Hart, the night watchman. Happening to glance for a moment from his shelter at about 2 a.m., Hart observed the glow of a lantern or pocket torch not far to the northward, and upon opening a door detected the figure of a man with a trowel very plainly silhouetted against the nearby electric light. At once starting in pursuit, he saw the figure dart hurriedly toward the main entrance, gaining the street and losing himself amongst the shadows before approach or capture was possible. Like the first of the ghouls active during the past year, this intruder had done no real damage before detection. A vacant part of the ward lot showed little signs of superficial digging, but nothing even nearly the size of a grave had been attempted, and no previous grave had been disturbed. Hart, who cannot describe the prowler except as a small man probably having a full beard, inclines to the view that all 3 of the digging incidents have a common source, but police from the second station think otherwise on account of the savage nature of the second incident when an ancient coffin was removed and its headstone violently shattered. The first of the incident, in which it is thought an attempt to bury something was frustrated, occurred a year ago last March, and has been attributed to bootleggers seeking a cache. It is possible, says Sergeant Riley, that this third affair is of a similar nature. Officers at the second station are taking especial pains to capture the gang of miscreants responsible for these repeat outrages. All Thursday, Dr. Willett rested as if recuperating from something past, or nerving himself for something to come. In the evening he wrote a note to Mr. Ward, which was delivered the next morning, and which caused the half-dazed parent to ponder long and deeply. Mr. Ward had not been able to go down to business since the shock of Monday with its baffling reports and its sinister purgation, but he found something calming about the doctor's letter, in spite of the despair it seemed to promise and the fresh mysteries it seemed to evoke. Number 10, Barnes Street, Providence, Rhode Island. April 12, 1928. Dear Theodore, I feel that I must say a word to you before doing what I am going to do tomorrow. It will conclude the terrible business we have been going through, for I feel that no spade is ever likely to reach that monstrous place that we know of. But I am afraid it won't set your mind at rest unless I expressly assure you how very conclusive this is going to be. You have known me ever since you were a small boy, so I think you will not distrust me when I hint that some matters are best left undecided and entirely unexplored. It is better that you attempt no further speculation as to Charles's case, and almost imperative that you tell his mother nothing more than she already suspects. When I call on you tomorrow, Charles will have escaped. That is all which remain in anyone's mind. He was mad, and he escaped. You can tell his mother gently and gradually about the mad part when you stop sending the typed notes in his name. I'd advise you to join her in Atlantic City and take a rest yourself. God knows you need one after this shock, as do I myself. I'm going south for a while to calm down and to brace up. So don't ask me any questions when I call. It may be that something will go wrong, but I'll tell you if it does. I don't think it will. There will be nothing more to worry about, for Charles will be very, very safe. He is now safer than you can dream. You need hold no fears about Alan, or who or what he is. He forms as much a part of the past as Joseph Curwen's picture, and when I ring your doorbell you may feel certain that there is no such person alive. And what wrote that minuscule message will never trouble you or yours. But you must steel yourself to melancholy, and prepare your wife to do the same. I must tell you frankly that Charles's escape will not mean his restoration to you. He's been afflicted with a peculiar disease, as you must realize from the subtle physical as well as mental changes in him, and you must not hope to see him again. Have only this consolation, that he was never a fiend or even truly a madman, but only an eager, studious, and very curious boy whose love of mystery and the past was unfortunately his undoing. He stumbled upon things that no mortal ever ought to know, and reached back through the years as no one else should reach. And something came out of those years to engulf him. And now comes the matter in which I must ask you to trust me, for there will be indeed no uncertainty about Charles's fate. In about a year, say, you can, if you wish, devise a suitable account of the end, for the boy will then be no more. You can put up a stone in your lot at the north burial ground exactly 10 feet west of your father's and facing the same way, and that will mark the true resting place of your son. Nor need you fear it that it will mark any abnormality or changeling. The ashes in that grave will be those of own unaltered bone and sinew of the real Charles Dexter Ward, whose mind you watched from infancy, the real Charles, with the olive mark on his hip and without the black witch mark on his chest or the pit on his forehead. The Charles who never actually did evil and who will have paid with his life for his squeamishness. That is all. Charles will have escaped, and a year from now you can put up his stone. Do not question me tomorrow, and believe that the honor of your fair ancient family remains untainted now, as it has been all the times in the past. With profoundest sympathy and exhortations to fortitude, calmness, and resignation, I am ever sincerely your friend, Mariners B. Willett. So on the morning of Friday, April 13th, 1928, Mariners Bicknell Willett visited the room of Charles Dexter Ward at Dr. Waite's private hospital on Connecticut Island. The youth, though making no attempt to evade his caller, was in a sullen mood and seemed disinclined to open the conversation, which Willett obviously desired. The doctor's discovery of the crypt and his monstrous experience therein had of course created a new source of embarrassment, so that both hesitated perceptibly after the interchange of a few strained formalities. Then a new element of constraint crept in, as Ward seemed to read beyond the doctor's mask-like face a terrible purpose which had never been there before. The patient quailed, conscious that since the last visit there had been a change whereby the solicitor's family physician had given place to the ruthless and implacable avenger. Ward actually turned pale, and the doctor was first to speak. "More," he said, "has been found out, and I must warn you fairly that reckoning is due." "Digging again and coming upon more poor starving pets," was the ironic reply. It was evident that the youth meant to show bravado to the last. "No," Willett slowly rejoined. "This time I did not have to dig. We have had men looking up Dr. Allen and found the false beard and spectacles in the bungalow." "Excellent," commented the disquieted host, in an effort to be wittily insulted. "And I trust they proved more becoming than the beard and glasses you now have on." "They would become you very well," came the even and studied response, as indeed they seemed to have done. As Willett said this, it almost seemed as though a cloud passed over the sun, though there was no change in the shadows on the floor. Then Ward ventured, "And is this what asks so hotly for a reckoning? Suppose a man does find it now and then useful to be truthful." "No," said Willett gravely. "Again, you are wrong. It is no business of mine if any man seeks duality, provided he has any right to exist at all, and provided he does not destroy what called him out of space." Ward now started violently. "Well, sir, what have you found, and what do you want of me?" The doctor let a little time elapse before replying, as if choosing his words for an effective answer. "I have found," he finally intoned, "something in a cupboard behind an ancient oval mantel where a picture once was, and I have burned it and buried the ashes where the grave of Charles Dexter Ward ought to be." The madman choked and sprang from the chair in which he had been sitting. "Damn you, who did you tell, and who'll believe it was he after these 2 full months with me alive? What do you mean to do?" Willett, though a small man, actually took on kind of a judicial majesty as he claimed the patient with gesture. "I have told no one. This is no common case. It is madness out of time and a horror from beyond the spheres, which no police or lawyers or courts or alienists could ever fathom or grapple with. Thank God some chance has left me inside the spark of imagination that I might not go astray in thinking out this thing. You cannot deceive me, Joseph Kerwin, for I know that your accursed magic is true. I know how you wove the spell that brooded outside the gears and fastened on your double and descendant. I know how you drew him into the past and got him to raise you up from your detestable grave. I know he kept you hidden in his laboratory while you studied modern things and roved abroad as a vampire by night, and how you later showed yourself in beard and glasses that no one might wonder at your godless likeness to him. I know what you resolved to do when he balked at your monstrous rifling at the world's tombs, and what you planned afterwards, and I know how you did it. You left off your beard and glasses and fooled the guards around the house. They thought it was he who went in, and they thought it was he who came out when you had strangled and hidden him. But you hadn't reckoned on the different contents of 2 minds. You were a fool, Joseph Kerwin, to fancy that a mere visual identity would be enough. Why didn't you think of the speech and the voice and the handwriting? It hasn't worked, you see, after all. You know better than I who or what wrote that message in minuscule, but I will warn you, it was not written in vain. There are abominations and blasphemies which must be stamped out, and I believe that the writer of those words will attend to Orne and Hutchinson. One of these creatures wrote you once, do not call up any that you cannot put down. You were undone once before, and perhaps in that very way, and it may be that your own evil magic will undo you again. Kerwin, a man can't tamper with nature beyond certain limits, and every horror that you have woven will rise up to wipe you out." But here the doctor was cut short by a convulsive cry from the creature before him, hopelessly at bay, weaponless, and knowing that any show of physical violence would bring a score of attendants to the doctor's rescue. Joseph Kerwin had recourse to his once ancient ally and began a series of cabalistic motions with his 4 fingers as his deep hollow voice, now unconcealed by feigned hoarseness, bellowed out the opening words of a terrible formula. Per Adonai Elohim, Adonai Jehovah, Adonai Sabaoth, Metraton. But Willett was too quick for him, even as the dogs in the yard outside began to howl, and even as a chill wind sprang suddenly up from the bay, the doctor commenced the solemn and measured intonation of that which he had meant all along to recite. An eye for an eye, magic for magic. Let the outcome show how well the lesson of the abyss had been learned. So in a clear voice, Marina's Bignell Willett began the second of that pair of formulae whose first had raised the writer of those minuscules, the cryptic invocation whose heading was the dragon's tail, sign of the descending node. Ogthrod Eif, Geblege, Yorksothoth Negang Ei, Sro. At the very first word from Willett's mouth, the previously commenced formula of the patient stopped short. Unable to speak, the monster made wild motions with his arms until they too were arrested. And when the awful name of Yog-Sothoth was uttered, the hideous change began. It was not merely a dissolution, but rather a transformation or a recapitulation, and Willett shut his eyes lest he faint before the rest of the incantation could be pronounced. But he did not faint, and that man of unholy centuries and forbidden secrets never troubled the world again. The madness out of time had subsided, and the case of Charles Dexter Ward was now closed. Opening his eyes before staggering out of the room of horror, Dr. Willett saw that what he had kept in memory had not been kept amiss. There had, as he predicted, been no need for acids. Like his accursed picture a year before, Joseph Curwen now lay scattered on the floor as a thin coating of fine, bluish, grey dust.